this meeting for January 27th, 2021. If we could stand and have a Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge of allegiance to the flag
To the
of the United
United
States
States of America,
and to the
and to the
republic
republic
for which
for
it
which it
stands,
stands,
one
one
nation,
nation,
under
under
God,
God,
with indivisible, with liberty
liberty,
and
and justice for all.
I just want to remind folks that the meeting is being held fully in accordance with Governor of Massachusetts' March 12th, 2020 order suspending certain provisions of the open meeting law. This meeting is on BCAT's live streaming, so you can watch it live there. If you'd like to join the meeting, the town website has the link that you can join WebEx, or you can call 408-418-9388, and the access number is, or the meeting number is 179-301-2251. Thank you. So tonight, I'll just quickly ask if there's, first thing on the agenda is public participation. Is there anyone who wants to talk about anything that's not on tonight's agenda? Seeing no one, we'll move on to the budget guidelines for FY 2020. John Paul?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Do you have the slides? You're going to put them up on the screen or?
Yep, I will put them up on the screen.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
I can. Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Awesome.
I can see the slides.
Okay, everybody, thank you for being here. As I'm sure you probably already know, this is probably the beginning of probably what's going to be one of our more difficult budget years, certainly that I can remember anyway. I know that there are many members of the committee that have been here longer than me, but certainly this is definitely the most challenging budget that we faced. Within the past week or so, we were able to meet with Steve and John, as well as Superintendent Conti, Nicole Kosha, Tom and Christine from the school committee, as well as Selectman Morandi and Selectman Tigas on the preliminary budget discussion. Subsequent to that, John, Gary, and I spent some additional time with Superintendent Conti and Nicole just to get an even more in-depth understanding of where they stood in terms of the budget. And this is the presentation that we're going to give you tonight. And at the end, we'll have our recommendation for how we feel that we should proceed for this budget year. Just in order to start, I guess we'll start with where we were last year. So last year, we came to the acknowledgement, finally, after many years, thankfully, that we didn't actually control both aspects of the budget. You know, we could pick an operating budget increase, or we could pick a tax levy limit, but we really didn't have the ability to control both of those variables. So I think what we had decided on was a methodology where we determine what the operating budgets are going to be and allow that to drive the tax levy, as opposed to picking a tax levy and drilling down to the operating budget. So that's the presentation, and that's the format that we'll be going with tonight. Last year, for operating budgets, blended between the town and the school, we settled on a 3.5% blended rate. Next slide, please, Steve. And as you recall, last year was kind of a unique year in that we started out with the 3.5 operating budget guideline, which was 3.25% for the town, 3.75% for the school. As you know, we approved a budget in June. We asked town meeting to work with us because when COVID hit, we were so far along in the planning process for the budget that we requested that, you know, we approve the budget that we've been working on, and then subsequently we would be back in September with any necessary adjustments that needed to be made to keep the budget in balance. And that's just what we did. You can see in June that we approved an approximately right on target with our guidelines in terms of operating budgets. But in September, as you know, we had to go back and make some reductions to the budget. We tried to focus on accommodated accounts in those areas of the budgets which would impact services the least. Still was a very difficult process for us. As you may recall from the operating budgets, both the town and the school reduced by approximately 350,000. And at the end of the day, the final operating budget increases for the town and the school were, 2.86 for the town. I'm sorry, 2.86 blended with a 2.3 approximately for the town and a 3.25 for the school. And we understand that the reductions that we made were very difficult, without question. Next slide, please. As a result of those guidelines, we set a rate in the fall, a tax rate within the typical range where we typically fall. And the end result of that for the average single-family homeowner was approximately a $245 increase on approximately $570,000 average house, I believe. Jim Doherty's here as well. He can correct me on that, but that's just a ballpark number. And just so everybody is aware, we did receive quite a bit of pushback from the Board of Selectmen on that. They felt as though, that was high, and it was someplace they didn't want to be on a regular basis in terms of those folks in town that are on a fixed income. Next slide, please. At this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to John Denizio so he can talk to you a little bit about what we're expecting in terms of our revenues for the upcoming year.
Thank you, Paul. Steve, before I start, can you just check the waiting room? Jim Doherty tells me he's in the waiting room waiting to get let in.
Okay, I'll try to figure that out.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Can you go to the next slide, too?
Sure.
So the previous slide just outlined what the three major categories for revenues that for our operating budget are, which is local receipts, state aid, and the tax levy. The first one we're going to talk about is local receipts. We talked a lot about it last year. Going into last year, we had decreased our revenue estimates in this category by $4.5 million. We came back, as Paul just spoke about, we came back in the fall and had to decrease about another $2.1 million. We talked many times about what the hardest hit areas are. Hotel tax is down 65% since the last full non-COVID year. Meals tax 35%, and permits 67% in the same time frame. So this year through 6 months, we're sort of in line. We have some reason to be optimistic, but we've got a whole nother half a year to go. So hopefully, if things keep going the way they are, we'll make it for this year. But for the budget projection for next year, we're lucky to level fund this category. Steve, can you go to the next slide?
Yeah, I'm not finding the waiting room.
Okay. Next category is state aid. In FY21, it was held harmless, mostly due to federal revenues backfilling the states. The governor's budget was released today, and there was some good news there. Both of our state aid accounts, big ones, Chapter 70 and UGA, saw the minimum aid increases in it, which is promising. We are hopeful that there won't be a decrease. The increase isn't what we're excited about. It's that the first budget that came out has us not having any decrease at all. So that's good news there. Steve, next slide. Tax levy. So third category, if we're not projecting any increase or just a small increase in state aid and no increase in local receipts, that means that the tax levy has to pick up the burden of all of the tax levy increase in the budget. So this year, Paul talked about it earlier, this year was an increase about 5.5% in the levy increase. That translated to $245 on the average single family tax bill, and led to a lot of conversations with the Board of Selectmen about how we can sort of buck that trend of the 5.5% levy increases and get that down a little bit. Next slide, Steve. So Gary's going to take over from here, and I'm going to try to find Jim Doherty.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Members of the board, committee, excuse me. The taking a look, as John, Paul, and I and Jim started looking at the budget for 2022, staring at us was what was going on with the pandemic, which we all know has happened, and some potential changes to some of the values to our real estate. The residential real estate has continued to increase and has gotten stronger as people try to move into the suburbs. While the commercial sector, if you look at the office versus the retail, you can see empty parking lots. The office still has leases in place in most cases, and over the next 2 or 3 years, as existing tenants look to release, the estimates are, if you talk to people in the commercial sector, they say they're going to look for less space. The retail took a big hit, as we know, with the restaurants and the hospitality side. With the restaurants, the hotels, and the retail stores, you can look in the mall and look to see different retailers going into bankruptcy. So as we looked at the values and how we allocate that and look at where our revenues are coming from, we, just to be in the conservative side, and as you can see the change in the value, we looked at if there was a 10% decrease in the commercial sector, what would happen to the residential side as that remains strong. And and Jim, if he's in the room, can talk about it more. If he's not, I'll explain a little more, but the assessments won't be done for quite a few months. We're just anticipating what could happen here. And with that, the change in the average residential rate could be twice as much as it was last year, could be 3 times as much. And we wanted to start determining that versus as the budget was going forward. Jim could discuss more the assessors and what they have to do. They have a lot of work going forward the next few months. And I don't know, John, if he's available. I can talk a little more about it.
There is a call-in user that I'm not sure who is that call-in user.
Steve, that's me.
Okay. So
Is that Jim? Okay, thanks.
I would turn that over to Jim and let him talk about the difficult position the assessors are in, or the as he moves forward. Jim?
Sure. Thanks, Gary. So this is like the 3rd or the 4th time we've run through this with various stakeholders in the town, which I think is a very good thing. But as I've said in the previous couple of venues, I think it's extremely early to start, going too far out. Let me just say 2 things to you. Commercial real estate valuations are done on an income approach to value primarily for investment purposes. One is they're done on a direct capitalization rate, which means you look at with blinders on a single year of income. Other ways to look at it, which a lot of investment companies, i.e. majority of our commercial property in town, they look at it from the standpoint of a discounted cash flow. So they spread it over a period of time. There is no underestimating what Gary has laid out, but we need to also put in perspective and crystallize it 2 things. We're talking about fair market values and we're talking about assessed values. The Department of Revenue in all communities do a statistical analysis on residential property because it's the only one where you have sufficient quantity to get anything that arguably is indicative of what's happening. So from a commercial value standpoint, there is no doubt. I'm not going to waste everybody's time, which everybody knows, and what Gary just indicated, that people are hurting out there. how bad, how much, how much have these people, these REITs, these major corporations, have they reflected in impairment value on their books and records? I've worked for a couple of major accounting firms, and I think there is a lot of other tangible information that will guide us. So we are just in the process of sending out the income and expense statements that we send out every year. Many of you have heard me reference this in other forums where we have a large percentage of our institutional investors who neglect, for numerous reasons, to supply that information each year. We're doubling down this year. We're reminding them of the state law that allows the appellate tax board to dismiss these cases when these taxpayers refuse to provide the information, and we intend to vigorously pursue those this year. Having said that, we're not trying to bury our head in the sand. It's a big issue. It's not a Board of Assessors issue. It's a community issue. The town is going to receive the amount of revenue they need based on Prop 2.5 to sustain the levy. The real issue is who pays what. The town has been very fortunate that we've had the commercial people paying a good portion. We hope to see that continue. And I would just caution everyone at this stage of the game, recognize the problem. Don't jump to hypothetical analysis. In this case, just one scenario that Gary asked me to run with the 10% reduction in commercial values and holding residential where they were last year. I don't necessarily disagree with the residential portion. I just caution you on the commercial side. Again, that reflects a 10% reduction in market value. We need to look at what assessed value ratios and many other aspects are as they come into play. Thanks.
Thanks, Jim. John, are you picking up? Is that Paul?
Yeah, I think Paul's picking up.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, thank you, Steve. So the FY22 budget goals, similar to what we've always tried to do with the budget. We've tried to maintain the level of services where possible. We're certainly aware that under the current fiscal year and the guideline that we're suggesting that we won't be maintaining a level of services right now, unfortunately. We've always tried to prioritize our investment in our infrastructure. I think our debt and reinvestment program is something that we should be very proud of. We've been able to replace schools, replacing a public works facility currently, and we've been able to do that without overrides, without debt exclusions, by fitting it in our typical ordinary operating budget guidelines. And we still have the capacity to do some of the important projects that have been waiting on the list for a while. So the debt program as of right now is still solid, and we believe in it, and we believe that we will be able to continue to invest in the community going forward. This comes up all the time, and it's a discussion about fees. The town has historically been opposed to fees for services. We try to put as much of our services underneath the tax levy so that it's fair for everybody. But certainly, I think we're all aware that many other communities do utilize fees for a variety of services. In Burlington, we try to stay away from fees as much as possible. Something that we're going to need to consider going forward is, our long-term liabilities, our pension liability, our OPEB liability. As everybody's aware, one of the big cuts we made to balance the budget last September was eliminating almost all of the OPEB payment. Again, the OPEB program was something that we were also very proud of in terms of working towards the future of the town and lowering our future liabilities with our payment schedule on OPEB. Again, a lot of work went into that. So we're very disappointed to see that cut. But again, at the time, that is the most least harmful cut to services, to students, to the entire town, in our opinion. And this is something that's definitely new for us this year, but given the uncertainty of the budget, we're really going to have to consider the use of our reserves in different ways as it relates to the operating budget. As you know, we have a sustainable budget where we do not use reserves in our typical budget process. We only use them for pay-as-you-go capital. But this is a year where we're probably going to have to consider the use of reserves to keep our budget whole based upon the guidelines. And we'll have to prioritize that in a certain way, but certainly the first use of reserves would be to replace lost revenue. John already went through what we're dealing with on our local receipts. So if we don't meet those numbers and we're unable to make further cuts to the budget, we will be recommending that the first use of reserves towards the budget would be to replace lost local revenues. And again, we got some relatively good news from the state today in the fact that we don't have a cut yet. But if the state were to sort of change what they're able to do for us, we would consider the use of reserves to replace any losses on state revenue. The next area of reserves would be to pay down, potential one-time budget buster items, snow and ice deficits and things of that nature. Clearly, there will be a need for some type of capital this year. I don't think we're going to be recommending a regular capital plan type of year, but I think that there will be some, what I would call emergency requests from departments, whether it's a capital item that, we need to keep a building open or to keep a program going. I do anticipate that there will be some capital requests, but we will be encouraging as few as possible and really looking at only the emergency ones. Again, we don't know how long this thing is going to last. I think that one thing that I've learned in my time in this business is, our things tend to go bad for us a little bit later than what happens in the regular economy, and we tend to come back a little bit later as well. So if the current economy is hurting, it tends to affect us a little bit a year or two down the road more so. That's been my experience, and we don't know how long this is going to last, and we don't know how long that we're going to have to rely on reserves to potentially plug holes in our budget. The next item for reserves also would be, and again, least desirable would be to supplement services that we just can't cut. And again, that's up for discussion and something that we haven't had to do in my entire tenure here. But if this tax levy generates, a tax bill that is really unrealistic for our residents to pay, then we will have to consider using reserves to reduce the tax burden on the residents in our businesses. So we never use reserves in terms of our budget, but clearly this is a year and a time frame that's unlike no other. And they are rainy day funds. This is a rainy time for us, and this may be a time where we have to sort of go against our principles and use some of our reserves during the budgeting process. I think I covered all the categories there, but I guess we'll try the next slide, Steve. As you can see there, that's where we stand. Try not to get too excited by the free cash number. That was a planned approach. We didn't actually generate hardly any new free cash last year. The large number is simply the result of the fact that, as you may recall, we pulled back on the capital plan. We did not move forward with using free cash last year for many capital items, and we cut back significantly on that. So as a result of not spending free cash last year, we have some more to work with for this year. That was planned, as you know. Stabilization fund, we've been holding around close to a $10 million balance for a couple of years now. And excess taxing or levy capacity, for the previous fiscal year, we were $12 million below our taxing capacity. Obviously, that is something that is a direct impact on the residents and businesses. So it's least desirable to tap into too much of that, but it is available for the town's use moving forward. Steve? Thank you. Okay, so I talked about this a little bit on the last slide, but this is the sort of order of reserves that we feel that we may need to utilize in this year's budget. And just in case we've never talked about it before, the reason why we don't like to use non-recurring revenues in our budget, and we call our budget sustainable, because our ordinary recurring revenues cover our ordinary recurring expenses. So when you start to supplement your budget with one-time revenues, you sort of build yourself a hole for the following year and the year after. So it's a difficult thing to sort of back off from. So anytime that we use reserves in this budget, if we have to, we're going to want to have a plan as to sort of how we walk that back in the subsequent years, because ultimately we want to be back to having a sustainable budget, where again, the recurring ordinary revenues that we normally get will cover our ordinary operating budget. Next one, Steve. Okay, so here's where, John, you want to walk through these assumptions?
Sure, thank you, Paul. So as we've gone through them, we'll just sort of a recap. We're projecting no to very little increase in local receipts or state aid, and if we were to have some need to decrease what our projections are for local receipts by a big number, that's where what Paul was talking about could be a potential use of free cash. That one is easy to wean yourself off of that. It does create the structural deficit, but you can have a plan on how you're going to wean yourself off. As those revenues come back, you use less and less of that free cash. We want to project realistic accommodated accounts. We think the best we're going to do is in the range of 5 to 5.5%. We want to set minimal operating budget increases, basically just a carry forward. If we can increase, the original was 3% was the administration's recommendation. After a lot of conversation between a lot of stakeholders, the new recommendation is the blended rate of 3.25, which is 3% for the town, 3.5% for the school. And really our ultimate goal was to try to control the tax levy increase, given that last year was a little bit of an anomaly, hopefully, and that we just don't know what's going to happen with the values, and our normal dollar increase could be quite higher. Next slide, Steve. So as I let the cat out of the bag on the last slide, the original conversations we were having, the administration was thought it best to recommend the 3% blended rate, and that's circled there. You can see that the increases that we were talking about would result in an estimated levy increase of about 4.8%. That's updated given the information we got today from the governor's budget. Next slide, Steve. And that slide just talks about, after talking with all the stakeholders and concerned about what exactly the 3% blended rate was going to mean to services, the administration recommended 3.5 blended rate now. Paul, you might want to speak to that.
Well, like I say, we've had extended conversations, in particular with Superintendent Conti and Nicole, and we certainly understand the predicament that the school department is in, and this is certainly not a great budget. But I guess one of our biggest fears is that if we don't get it right this year, it's only going to prolong sort of this budget crisis we're in. So if we sort of miss and come in too high, I think it just puts us in an even worse situation in the following year. So just really hesitant in trying. I know this is extremely difficult, especially in comparison to recent years. But again, I think from our standpoint, we're really concerned about, getting it wrong even and giving too generous a guideline, because I think it will prolong the difficult budget situation that we're in. So again, we were able to discuss this and move it a little bit further along, and that's what we'll be presenting with you tonight. I'm not sure if we have another slide, but we're certainly all here and we're all available to answer any questions that the committee may have.
That's the last slide.
Slides.
I can leave the slide up here for now if people want, or I can close it out. It's up to, if you have a preference, let me know. Does the committee have questions? Sure, there's a couple. Let's see, Frank.
Frank, you're muted.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm sorry. I keep getting this button backwards. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a series of simple questions, and I think I'm just going to roll them out. They're mostly, I think, for Paul and John. My first question is, on this last slide, which is still up, as sort of a pro forma target here, you're showing the accommodated account at 5.25%. Does that assume that OPEB is knocked out again?
Right, that assumes funding at least half.
Aha. Okay, so that's about 400,000 if my memory's right.
Yep.
Okay, that's good. Next question is on the levy, the estimated levy of 4.99. Let's just for round numbers call it 5. That assumes the 10%. That assumes a 10% commercial drop. Is that correct?
No, Frank, this is just a levy increase, doesn't have anything to do with the values. It's just a growth in the total levy.
I see. So the question would be, how many of the dollars go to the non-commercial versus the commercial?
Correct.
Yeah, so that indicates how much money we need to raise through the levy. So we need to raise 5%, assuming the lost revenue from hotel, meals. No, it doesn't. It doesn't assume any. That's just how much money we need, right?
Correct. That's taking the total amount, less the local receipts, less state aid, the rest being on the levy and the growth year over year.
Okay, and the drop on the local receipts is based on the run rate that we're seeing right now.
So it doesn't assume a drop in the budget for next year. Assume same budget we have this year for next year.
All right, so what I'm trying to get at is I had sent Whitney and a few other people an email. I'm not trying to put you on the spot, forget that. I just have a question here. So this sort of implies a residential tax increase of another $250.
No.
Am I correct?
Given no change in the values, it would be around there.
All right, so
Last year was 5.5% increase, and it was 245. So.
right. So one thing that I would like to see, and you may not be able to do it, you may not even want to do it, but to me, the average residential number is driven off of the average value of all assessed residential property. And what I'd like to see is 3 tiers: the lower group of residential value, the middle group, and the higher group. We've got a lot of new homes built, so they're clearly in the higher group, the 800,000 and on up group. And I just wonder if it would be useful for us to see the impact to each of those groups on an estimated basis. Is that something that you would be willing to do and think would be useful?
So I'm going to defer to Jim Doherty if he's still on. I'm not sure how much work that is, but
So what I'm getting at is the average increase is significant to anybody. I mean, $250 more a year, that's, like, 90 cents a day or something. That's still significant. For people that are on fixed incomes and less discretionary money and lower value property, I'd like to know how much we're hitting them separately from the middle and from the top, just for reference. So is that something we could do?
Frank, Jim Doherty here. Always a pleasure. I would just say this initially, that basically to correct the, not to correct, but just to make sure we're all dealing with the same issue. The 245 and change, I don't have the documents in front of me, but that's based on, as well as the average assessment, on just single-family homes. So it's not skewed. We've taken that out when my tenure started. I'm not sure about maybe even a little before then. So that it's not skewed by condominiums or apartment houses, okay, which all fall into the residential class. So we've tried to give a more accurate depiction of the primary residential group in the town. Now, to the question of, you know, the ranches, smaller ranches versus the, you know, the larger colonials coming in. Essentially, if you double it, right, because a lot of the large colonials are assessed over $1 million. And as Paul referenced at the outset, I think it's about 570, 572, 574, something like that this year for single family home. So you double it, it's going to be double the amount for those people. We certainly can run a lot of these scenarios in, you know, whatever the pleasure, you know, of the Ways and Means, the administration or whatever is. There's no problem doing any of that.
Well, so thank you, Jim. That's most of the answer. I'd leave it to the chair. What you're saying is that this average number hits around the $550,000 assessed value home. Is that correct?
I think about 570, Frank.
All right. So, and I suppose I'm making a kind of a wild assumption here, but I'm assuming that fixed income, you know, 1950s, 1960s, smaller raised ranches, those types of homes aren't that much less than the 570. You know, they might go down to 480. Yeah. All right. So that
You're
does.
correct, because it's skewed that way. The majority, even, and you see it in the marketplace, unfortunately, for a lot of, you know, a lot of young people want to move in, a lot of other people, but whatever. It's, you know, capitalism, right? Bottom line is this. Any of the tear downs, they're now over $400,000.
Okay.
A year ago, they were at 300. So you're 100% right. That number is definitely skewing, and it's constantly going to skew towards the higher end.
Okay. I think I have enough information for my thinking anyway. So thank you. I'm all set. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Frank. Kelly?
Just a quick question, and forgive me for being new to Ways and Means, but at the Chamber's Government Affairs discussion this morning, we were talking about $1 million economic development grant, which we will receive thanks to Ken Gordon, and I'm sure the work of the town in conjunction with Bedford. So we'll have to sort of figure out how to divvy that up in order to convert some of the office space to life sciences. Correct me if I misspoke, Paul. I don't assume that would have any bearing on anything we're talking about here.
Yeah, unfortunately, thank you, Kelly. Yes, unfortunately, that is great news, and thank you to Representative Gordon on that. But unfortunately, outside sources like that, we have quite a few of them in town. We typically get them for specific purposes and grants. They don't have any impact on the operating budget that we're talking about here tonight. Certainly beneficial to the town as a whole, but doesn't impact our discussions here tonight. It doesn't help us with revenue in that sense.
Figured I'd try. Thanks, Paul.
Oh, I see Mike, David, and then Phil. So Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So there's something I've been kind of watching for a few years, and I'm curious what the dynamic is, and that's the school budget versus the town budget. I think, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but like the blended rate makes it look like it's 3% town, 3.5% increase for school. That's going to come out to 3.25%. But the school budget's been growing at a faster rate than the town budget, and it's not 50-50 anymore. I'm just curious, is this still possible? So let's say it's really, instead of 50-50, it's 60-40 on the total budget.
John or Paul?
Just quickly on that, not to speak of whether it's sustainable or not, but the Mike, that we started talking about that last year a little bit, that the blended rate isn't exact. So that's why this year we're kind of nailing down the two numbers specifically for that exact reason.
Yeah.
I don't have an answer for your your exact question. I just wanted to make that point.
Yeah, okay, I guess it's just over time, it comes a little harder to make it a nice round, in the middle overall projection, but that's fine. Thank you.
David?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Is Jim, are you still on the line? Jim Doherty?
Dave, I'm still on.
Great,
Yeah, go
thank
ahead.
you. So I just wanted to get a little bit more of an understanding in your world. The big thing that could hit us on this as well is really kind of the shift that we potentially could see between the commercial valuations. I mean, we're having a levy increase, but again, the shifting more so on the residential burden and less on the commercial is where really the impact could even be greater to us as residents. So, Jim, you spoke about the kind of, the difference in assessed values and appraised values. And obviously you send out your income and expense statements, and they're supposed to fill them out. And obviously a lot of them are going to be bad this year because there's a lot of tenants that aren't paying. So again, taking the outrageous example that, a building had no rent for the year, obviously that's not going to make the value down to zero. So ultimately, I'm curious on the process as far as how do you value or assess these properties? Are they done like an appraisal, where again they're done over a period of time and you value it that way, where you take a cap rate over a period of time and then kind of assess a number that way, and how quickly are the property owners able to contest it, apply for abatements? How quickly is that going to reflect in our overall town valuation? Again, a lot of questions there, Jim, but kind of walk us through the process so we know how quickly this commercial impact could mean, which means greater burden on the residential.
Okay, I'll go, Dave, somewhere between hopefully Trump and Biden in terms of not forgetting the questions and hopefully not avoiding. So, and then I'll throw Fucci in there. Let's stick with the science. So what I mean by that, I guess, and Dave, you're the best. You know how much I appreciate you and Frank. You've always been my committee, and you guys always ask the right questions in the questions some people don't want to ask or hear. So let's start with what we know. We know historically for fiscal 19, we've got the residential sales. Everybody dabbles in it. Everybody owns it. They didn't go down, right? So we know that. So going back to what I referenced earlier, the Mass DOR, what do they do to certify a community? They come out and they make sure that you have prudent assessment assumptions in place, and you're looking at market data. What can they analyze? They can analyze single family homes and, who knows, outside the cities, 90% of the communities. That's what they did. That's what they're going to do next year. And that's what they're going to tell us. Looks like your commercial values have gone, your residential values have gone up. So we know that. What do we know about commercial values? We know, what we all see every day, as I mentioned earlier, Gary alluded to, empty parking lots. retailers crying, everybody, in a difficult, I'm not trying to undermine it by any stretch of the imagination. People are hurting, businesses are hurting, I get it. But again, let's not run and start ringing a bell, because as a banker, there's cartoons. I'm going to send this out, Paul. Remind me, John, remind me. I'm going to get this cartoon, and I think a lot of people have seen it. It's a cartoon that basically shows the banker showing up and the homeowner saying what the property's worth. It's worth like $1 million, right? Then they have the insurance guy showing up, and it's worth maybe, like $800,000 what they want to pay for insurance. Then they get the tax assessor showing up, and it's like $200,000. It's a tool shed, this and that. So I don't want to go too deep for a multitude of reasons. From a litigation standpoint, we have appeals. We've had appeals. We will always have appeals. We're going to have more appeals next year, and potentially in 23. But so I don't want to get into anything that could put the town at a disadvantage. I will simply say this. We look at market data. We have to reflect it. There is no getting around the fact that there could be a shift. The only silver lining here is the town is solvent. The levy's going out for whatever the town meeting and the town administration says that's going to be. It's going out. It's going to be collected at some point by Gary. So we know that. It's all about the shift as you laid out, Dave, and I can't sit here and tell you that. I'm going to, without going too far, there's always been conversation in Burlington about who pays what. How close to market value is this guy versus that guy? Maybe this guy's residential, maybe that guy's commercial. All I'm going to say is this. We want to see the information into what you mentioned. People are hurting. But you know what? There's a whole lot of these people who didn't and continue to not want to provide the data. So we don't even know what the high water mark is. They may come running in this year and tell us where the low water mark is. But we may also, as we wade through this really monumental valuation assignment we have here, we may also want to ask the fellas if they'd be generous enough to show us last year's data as well, so we can try to estimate what the impact's been. Have they been generous and they discounted rents for people, or did people go belly up? Are we talking blue chip companies who the stock market is cranking and their valuations are going through the roof? Or are we talking about, Jim Doherty's little pizza shop who, is really taking it in the shorts? So I think we have to be very cautious. I think you guys, as I'll say again, not to be disingenuous, you guys, and I mean this to all the ways and means when I've been there for 10 years, you guys ask the right questions, you're in early, and I will just say, Paul and John, and I'm sure Gary, if he was here back then, but Brian, who was here back then, we've all talked about these things going back to March, and I can't tell you other than looking at a lot of the same dark clouds. There's not a lot of new data per se on the table. John referenced the hotel tax and the meals tax. Yep, it's a problem. It was a problem back then. We knew it was coming. The best news I've heard tonight is that the state seems to be going to hold us harmless on state aid. So, not trying to avoid your question, Dave, but
No,
I
understand.
Yep. So,
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. John, if I could get this straight, this $499 number that reflected a $245 average tax increase for the $570,000 home. If I saw your previous slide correctly, if you projected a 10% decline in commercial industrial values, then that 245 could be 3 times as high.
Yeah,
Could be
Phil,
700.
just a clarification, the 245 we're talking about was obviously last year's increase.
Right.
And the levy growth was a little bit higher than this. But yes, you're right. The slide we showed, which was sort of just an illustration of what could happen, And Jim pointed out that that's not what we expect is going to happen, but just what it could happen. Yes.
Right, okay.
2
Well, let me ask about expectations. Denicio, Sagarino, Giannino, and Doherty were all in place in various places the last time we had a significant crash, which I think was 2008. Give or take a couple of years. Do you recall what the average decline was in your commercial values in your locations at that time?
Jim wasn't here back then, Phil, just to point that part
Well,
out. So.
he was in another place. He was in another spot. And I think John was in Woburn at that time, correct?
Yes.
And Gary certainly was here. He had to raise the tax levy. Just a reminder, Gary.
Thank you, Phil. Usually Paul does that to me every meeting.
Do you recall what the commercial industrial decline was at that time?
I do not. I know
Okay.
the average household increased about 10%. I don't remember the commercial.
Hey,
Okay.
Phil,
Yes,
Phil,
yes.
Jim Doherty. Hey, to answer your question, I don't recall what the drop was. You have to, again, the thing that people aren't focusing on here, and I don't mean that to be rude, but there was a change in the state legislation that changed the ability of communities, I think there were 10 or 12, to go from 1.75 classification as it is now, the max, up to, I believe it was either 1.9 or 2.0.
Right, they expanded it. I recall that.
And there's a payback. But having said that, to cut to the chase and really get to where you may want to go, what Gary's laying out, and if you want to put these things out there, they're facts. Again, I'll go back to what I said earlier, stick with the science. I believe, Paul, in one of those years, the high watermark for the residential increase was maybe almost $700, 690 rings a bell.
That is correct.
Okay, two other questions, Mr. Chairman. For Mr. Doherty, have you seen a significant increase in abatement requests to date on last year's bill? And secondly, are you adequately funded for defense on the abatement requests?
I'll take the last one first. We'll talk to you in May. Again, I'll go back to what I referenced with David. I really don't want to get into a lot of,
It's a yes or no, Jim.
At this point in time, I'm fine. Let's talk in May at town meeting on that. But, if you're talking about the values as of 1/20 for fiscal 21, where abatements are to be filed by February 1st, that's what you're referring to, Phil, in
Yes,
terms
yes.
of your first question about abatement?
Right.
The deadline is February 1st. Half full type person rather than a half empty, but I'm also a somewhat superstitious person, so I'm not going to comment on that other than saying, looking good so far, brother.
Okay,
But
that's good enough for me.
I will
Thank
just
you.
say this, they all come at the end. And if you really want to ask me the question about how I feel about the values, if they had a crystal ball like that, they probably would have won the mega box or the Powerball, because I don't think anybody as of January 1/20 knew what was going to happen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Phil.
Thank you, Jim.
Paul, and then I'll take John Heiler.
Sure. I just want to elaborate. At that time, despite the legislation, special legislation that was passed that Phil's referencing, we did have a 1-year increase of, I think it was close to $680 or so on the average single family, at a time when we would typically raise taxes about $100 a year. So we did have the benefit of special legislation back then. We have taken it upon ourselves to file similar legislation with Representative Gordon. It hasn't been officially filed yet, but they have it and they are working on it for us. So we're hopeful that if that makes its way through the legislature, that it'll at least give us another tool to work with in our toolbox, sort of as we address this problem next fall when we go to set the tax rate. So that just wanted to clarify for the committee. I know Phil had mentioned what we refer to around here as the perfect storm when Gary Giannino was on the Board of Selectmen, the highest tax rate in his increase in history. But we did have legislation, and we are pursuing that legislation as well currently.
Thanks, Paul. John Eiler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I had one question and one data point I want to throw out there. So first, data point. If I did my math correctly here, it looks like in FY21 the residential tax levy was 47 million. If we went from the 1x increase to the potential 3x increase, that would imply an extra 500 per typical house. And if I calculate correctly, that ends up being about 4 million. So the reason I did that is I'm just thinking, what if all of a sudden we got a whammy, the commercial rates really tanked, we didn't want to jack up the taxes, then it would mean roughly 4 million out of the reserves. So obviously not a good thing, but I was encouraged that it wasn't 100% of the reserves. So that's one thing. And a question for Paul, where or John, I'm curious, what is the local receipts trend? I understand, we're expecting it to be level, but if we look at over the last, 2 or 3 quarters where things have presumably, been tanked for a while now, what do we see in the trend?
Thanks, John. It's tough with the two biggies, with the meals and the rooms or the hotel tax, because unfortunately the state allowed fortunately for the businesses, they didn't have to pay right away. They were able to hold off on paying until October from back in March. So some of the quarterly receipts we got were for 5 months instead of 3. And we're still not fully caught up on what the tax liability and tax payment were. So we just don't have any good data yet. In total, they're right about where we were projecting. And hopefully they'll continue to grow a little bit in the next 6 months. But we don't have great data yet.
Okay, yeah, but that's a tough lag to be working with.
Yeah.
All right. Thank
Yeah,
you, Mr.
the
Chair.
third biggest category, building permits, is trending in the wrong direction.
That's hungry.
Yeah.
What is a quick follow-up on that, what is the timetable for the state to actually going forward for the next couple of months to get the local receipts taxes into the towns?
So you receive them quarterly. So we've gotten the quarterly payments. You get them at the end of September, end of December. We've got the first 2 payments, but they lag normally a month. So the info is for the 3 months prior to the month you get it in, excluding that month. That might sound a little confusing. So an example is September's payment is for June, July, and August.
Okay.
But as I said earlier, this year is a little different because September's payment could have been March, April, May, June, July. So
It's back to the regular schedule then, so when we had this, December's payment would have come in and that would have been September, October, November, and then we get that information when?
December with the payment. So they're
it would
on
be-
schedule. It's just
Okay.
it might not match up perfectly for everybody for paying that exact time frame.
So our next data point is then in March sometime.
Yes.
Okay, great, thanks. Roger.
Hi, Steve. Is this working?
I can hear you, but you're soft, so you might want to speak up.
All right. So I had a question. This is a sort of, again, about how so you mentioned that we would consider revenue replacement using reserves. And it seems like the obvious cases there are reduced values in the meals tax and the hotels tax. Have you had some discussions about how far you would go in terms of replacement, whether you would use it, and maybe John touched on this, to replace the commercial, drops in the commercial base? Or are you thinking it's strictly targeted at replacing local receipts types of funds?
So we had a few slides back. There's one that talks about uses of reserves, and those are really the categories we sort of talked about a little bit for each, and sort of in the priority order. Using it to for revenue replacement, in our opinion, is the best use of it if we have to go one of these routes, because you can plan to wean yourself off of that. And I think as important as deciding when and how much to use is to also have a plan on how you're going to get yourself off of that. But you can see, I think, Roger, your question was, have we talked about it for other uses, like the tax levy, if the increase is significant given the value change? So yes, we have, it's on there. To what degree, we haven't really got into that. I think when we start talking about it, it gets a little scary.
Yeah. So a question about, I guess, is about a timing. When would those discussions have to be made? Would they have to occur before May town meeting so that we know with good confidence that we can cover the revenue that we're going to get approval for?
Not necessarily. That we would need to approve any use of free cash before the tax rate is set, but that's complicated a little bit because in May we have free cash. We have this year's free cash. In September, if we hadn't certified free cash for next year yet, we may not have free cash, but we could use something else like stabilization. So May isn't a drop dead, no, and that is might be likely. If we were going to do something to lower the tax rate, that's something we would do in the fall probably, because we would have better info. As Jim was talking about before, there's just too many moving parts when we talk about estimating what the increase is going to be on the tax rate, and you don't have that till you have all the information in the fall.
Right. I guess I was trying to visualize the free cash and how one might earmark pieces of it for, different uses, including, making up various shortfalls. Sort of to know how much might be left. I'm also assuming that, and you mentioned this in terms of prioritizing capital, that we would probably defer some things if they committing to things beyond May based on the priorities.
I think that's safe to say, yes.
All right. Yeah, I guess I don't have any other questions. It seems, a lot of that is downstream and how do we fund it, but in terms of looking at the rate and what it is we need to run the municipal and the schools, I don't think there's a lot of choices there. I mean, I think that the goals you set out for it are good. So thank you.
So I just want one more point, Roger. I think it is exactly correct that, this is just one step approving here today, and then we're going to have lots of discussion about how much, if any, and how to use those reserves.
I do have one question regarding the free cash number. Is that 16.5 completely available, or is there stuff that's already earmarked off the top and we're starting from a smaller amount for things like capital improvements or something like that?
So that number that you saw a few slides back of 16.1 million is after town meeting this week. It was certified at 16.7 million. Well, we used about 600,000 at January town meeting just earlier on Monday. So that number is net of that. So that whole 16.1 is available as of right now with no definite earmarks.
Okay, great. Thanks. Mike?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So if we're looking at the rates, the 3.5% school, 3% for the town, what does that mean in terms of meeting the obligations that we have per contract? Are we okay being able to follow what's stated in the contracts in terms of increases and so forth for the employees.
I think in the conversations we had, Mike, was for both town and school. That doesn't quite get us there to the number we need to be at. Rolling everything forward, there's going to be some sort of efficiencies, restriction, or something we're going to need to do on both sides. Both sides committed to give that a try and see where we are. I think the schools have a gap, we have a gap, and until we really dig deep with all the department heads, we're not exactly sure what that is, but we're committed to trying to make that number.
Okay, so I think it probably goes without saying, it'll be a very lean year for supplies and kind of contract expenses then.
Yes, I think that's fair to say. And one big item for the school department, obviously, is they don't have a contract for next year. So that's quite a big unknown for them.
Okay, all right, thank you.
And there's still, I think, one contract out on the town side, right? That's Fire Command, if I remember correctly, or?
Correct, fire.
Okay. Frank?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question for Jim. If he's still on, just stand by a second, Jim. I want to make a nuanced point that maybe everybody gets it, but just in case. When we get around to wanting to tap into reserves, and it's likely that we'll want to take some. John Isla made a swag calculation of maybe a top number. But even if free cash isn't certified, we've got approximately 10 million in stabilization. So I think we know, to whatever extent we're willing to use any reserves, we can get at the money. It's just a question of how much do we want to burn down this year versus holding back. And then we could move money after stabilization certified, after free cash is certified in November or something, following back in. So I don't think it matters too much other than the 2/3 vote about how the money's pocketed. Do you agree with me, Paul or John?
Yes, that's correct.
All right, so that's really not an issue. The issue is how much of it do we dare use, and do we feel like we have to use? And we'll get to that. One other thing that this is maybe for Jim, but correct me if I'm wrong, but if we look at the value of property in Burlington, I believe that the value, if you just split the baby, call it all residential, whether it's condos or single family, but everything that's people live in, dwellings, versus commercial, everything that is an enterprise, the value of the property between those two is very much tilted towards residential, and the value of the property is less on the commercial side. Am I correct, Jim?
From last year's recap, Frank, the valuation is correct. It's like a 60-40 split, and then when we classify, it flips upside down.
Right. So not everybody might get that. So the net value of the properties is higher on the residential side. The tax commercial industrial split, a shift, or whatever that's called, a CIP or something, is the reverse. So the commercial people have less value, but pay $2 for every one of ours against their value on a tax basis. So the reason I'm bringing this up is that the residential side is holding steady. If anything, the value's going up. And so to whatever extent we're forced to take more dollars from the residential side, it's offset by the fact that it's a bigger thing we're taking it from, and that the higher end homes are going to help us out some. It's certainly not going to hurt. So I think it's a difficult guess what the average residential increase will actually turn out to be until we get quite a bit more detailed data. That's the way I look at this. And I don't think it's going to be, you can't just do simple algebra here. In my mind, there's no way it could triple. It just can't happen. We'd have to spend a ton of money we're not planning to spend and lose a lot more revenue than we're talking about. but it's likely to go up for sure. So that's the way I look at this.
Frank,
Thanks,
can
Frank.
I
Bill?
just follow?
Oh, sorry, let Jim go. Jim?
Chief, do you mind if I just follow up? It's really more directed towards Roger, but it ties right directly with Frank's talking about.
Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
So Roger, to your question, I think earlier, and Paul and John can correct me if I'm wrong, because I really haven't been involved in this side of it. But so basically, the recap, which is the kind of summary of how the town finances come together. It's made up for our conversation tonight, local receipts and tax levy. So I think your question was earlier, where do we start with using the reserves? And I think what Paul and John have set forth is we would start with local receipts, trying to augment those. So let's just assume that we lose 6, 8, 10, I don't have numbers in front of me, of local receipts, and we plug that gap. Whatever way you address that is really what you're doing is you're deciding what the tax levy is going to be. So then once you get that to a point where you say, okay, that levy is going up by X amount, whether it's $4.99, whether it's 4.25, whether it's 5.25 of last year, you've kind of established what that is. So now you know what you have to pay off, if you will, to establish that rate. Once that rate is set, then the values come into play, and that's where you really move to, I think the second part of your question was, which is, okay, now if we don't like, based on the values, based on the projected tax levy, what that impact is going to be to any class of property, you then decide whether you want to add to that levy or buy that levy down. And I just wanted to kind of clarify that. And I think that really dovetails into what you and Frank are both driving at.
Yeah, thanks.
Phil?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I like this plan. I think it's well considered. Here's my problem, and I don't want to speculate on values, as Jim suggested. However, this is more than what we're familiar with when Paul talked about the perfect storm. This is basically a major cultural shift, if I can use that term. Business travel is not going to recover for the next 4 or 5 years. We can see from our own meetings that it's not necessary to be out of the house. The retail market, if you look at Amazon sales, Walmart sales, are skyrocketing. Well, retail bricks and mortar are being punished tremendously. We can see it in our own town, how many are closing. And then secondarily, well, primarily, look at the office space. I mean, if you have children, those of you who are old enough to have working children, who are working in town in the high rent districts, I mean, those plans are already in place to reduce their square footage by, in some places 50, 60%. So this is not an economic decline that we recovered from quite rapidly back in Gary's time. I mean, this is a cultural decline that's going to take years for us to absorb these empty spaces. So although I like this plan and I'm hopeful you're dead on, Paul, I hope you got plan B and C in place. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, I certainly see Phil's aspect of it. It's something that I worry about as well, but I also have seen, conflicting reports as to, maybe only 1 in 10 will return back to its original state, or sorry, only 1 in 10 will continue to work virtually and most will come back. It's clearly unknown, and it's hard to guess at what it really will be. And that's why I worry about, making sure that the reserves that we do have will last us through this process. And so when it becomes necessary to draw down, I definitely want to be conservative in terms of the amount that we end up having to pull, just so that way in the event that we do need them for multiple years, we have them available. Any other questions? Do I have a motion to accept these numbers?
So moved.
I got Phil first. Can I get a second?
Second, Roger?
I'll take one from Roger. Any further discussion? All right, so I'll go down the line. David Tate,
Approve.
Doug Davidson, Doug?
Yes.
Thanks, Doug. Frank,
Yes.
Jaya,
Yes.
John Eiler,
Yes.
Kelly Pappas,
Yes.
Mike Hardy,
Yes.
Rob Neufeld,
Yes.
Roger Riggs,
Yes.
and I vote yes.
Did you get me?
Phil, I missed you.
That's all
Yeah,
right.
sorry, Phil.
Comment. Yes.
Phil, he's plotting against you.
No, I'm not plotting against it. I'm just going down the list of folks, and everyone had a last name except for Phil, so that was what did it. Awesome. So I sent out earlier the schedule for the budget season, and if you notice that we're getting started a little bit later and everything's a bit tighter. Our first foray into this will be February 24th with an overview of the budget and then presentation of books. And please let me know or let Whitney know. I think 6 folks have requested the binders rather than the electronic access. Whitney will show us the new electronic access, and then she will also place an electronic copy of the budget book for folks to get to without a password, so that way they can follow along at home. But I will also get a copy and a paper copy and see how I can distribute it if people want to request it to borrow it. But this is the budget. We start on March 10th, and we are going through, pretty much every week up until town meeting, up through except for April school vacation. And if there's slips or something like that, and we need to meet that particular week, we'll probably end up having to. But committee chair or subcommittee chairs take a look at the schedule, and if there's any sort of things that aren't achievable or need to be shifted around, please let me know. Are there any questions regarding that?
I have one quick question, Steve.
Go ahead, Doug.
So as we've moved away from Beeline and we've moved toward this new local transportation plan, we've said that that's going to move to Council on Aging, or at least Marge is going to be in charge of that. We may want to move that line item discussion away from John Sanchez's night and move it over to Council on Aging's night.
Great, thanks. I will ask Whitney to update that then. I thought I saw someone else's hand.
Steve, I had a question, if that's all right, David here.
Yeah, go ahead, David.
And just looking over the sheet, I don't have my budget book in front of me from last year, but some of the what changed from the past schedule to this one was the accommodated accounts. And I think Whitney kind of infused a lot of the accommodated accounts within this budget. One that I don't see is debt service. I don't know if there are other ones. So are there ones that are still missing that we will need to plug in at some point? Beeline obviously is not there, and that used to be a line item. I see, like the capital improvements for our leases you know, that's in the
Well,
MIS one.
I see debt service. It's on the April 21st, 28th, May 5th. Debt service is there at the second to last.
Oh, fantastic. I didn't even go down that far. Thank you. So everything should be there.
All right, great. I know Whitney wouldn't miss anything, I don't think,
I didn't think so.
other than that one little small thing. But if folks find anything else, please let me know or let Whitney and myself know and we'll adjust it. So that would mean that our next meeting would be February 24th in a couple of weeks. Whitney, did you want to present the access to the new website?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. I'll be brief. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but please let me know if you have any questions along the way. So as some of you may already know, we updated the town's website in November. So with the new town site comes a new Ways and Means site. And though we don't usually talk about the website until we present the budget, which I guess will be on the 24th this year, I did want to give a quick overview since everything is new and we're probably going to be relying more heavily on the site during this budget season. So that way, between now and the 24th, you may have a chance to make sure you can log on and see if there's any troubleshooting that we need to do before we really get into the weeds. So I'll send, I didn't do it before the meeting, but I'll send it as soon as we're done here to Steve, the login instructions to the new website so everybody can have a chance to look around. But I'll just really quickly share my screen just to show you what it looks like, if I can.
I made you a presenter, so you should be able to.
Okay. Can you see that?
I can. John
Okay.
can. Yep.
Yes? Okay, great. So first thing you'll see, the main website, burlington.org, is the same, the homepage. The whole thing looks a little bit different, hopefully better. Hopefully the website as a whole is a little bit easier to navigate, a little more user-friendly, but the content's very similar. So to get to the Ways and Means page, if you go to the Your Government tab under Boards and Commissions, there's a link for Ways and Means Committee. This front page is largely the same. It has the member listing, agendas and minutes. As Steve said, we'll be putting unpassword protected copy of the budget for public consumption, and then other related documents that don't go into the password protected section. To get into the password protected section, you're gonna now want to click this link up in the left corner, which will take you to a page that looks like this, and then you click existing account. I'll just throw mine in just to show you quickly what it looks like. So as you can see, we don't really have anything in 22 yet, but we reloaded everything from 21 so you can get an idea of what that looks like and also have that for reference going forward if you need to compare something. So like the big ticket items were the departmental budget. So that looks pretty much the same. It's just like a little bit better organized. And then another thing that we did last year, which arose out of necessity, but I think we'll definitely do it again. We got a lot of good feedback, was this warrant article summary page that has all the information and the backup. So we definitely plan on doing that. And I think that's all that I really wanted to cover. I don't know if anybody has any questions, but other than that, I'll turn it back over to you, Steve.
Great. Thank you very much. Any questions or everyone good? Roger.
Just a quick one. Looks like we have to create new logins as opposed to having a generic Ways and Means login.
Okay, so yeah, I created a single email and password, a Ways and Means Burlington email so that everybody can use the same one.
Okay, great, thanks.
That'll make more sense, I think, when you see the instructions.
Awesome. Thank you, Whitney. And then I think the final agenda item that everyone was looking forward to was meeting minutes from last week. Did anyone get a chance to review those? Any corrections? If not, I'll take a motion to approve.
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All right. Phil,
Yes.
David Tate,
Yes.
Doug Davidson,
Yes.
Frank Monaco,
Yes.
Jaya,
Yes.
John Eiler,
Yes.
Kelly,
Yes.
Mike Hardy,
Yes.
Rob Neufeld,
Yes.
Walter Riggs,
Yes.
and I'll vote yes. 11-0. Anybody else have anything that they would like to bring up? Frank, you have your hand raised?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you fine.
All right. I had a question. I don't want to change the minutes, but on the transportation reimbursement for the lift service, correct me if I'm wrong, anybody. My understanding is that the state reimburses us because Lyft can operate in the town of Burlington. It has nothing to do actually with the Council on Aging directly. Am I correct?
I think that's true, yes. I see John nodding his head.
Yeah. So the way,
Frank, you're talking about the Transportation Network Cooperative, the TNC
Yes.
money?
yes,
55,000, yeah.
yeah, yeah. So the way the minutes read, it kind of implies it's connected to a reimbursement for the Council on Aging using it. It doesn't matter. Lyft is in Burlington. We get that reimbursement by whatever calculation the state makes, and then and of course the argument was, are we using the money appropriately? Okay, so I understand, and thank you.
I have one
Right.
question, Mr. Chairman. For
Well,
Mr. Sagarino.
Yeah,
Is
let's,
any more of our money going to Big Dig South in Billerica here? The Middlesex Turnpike annuity construction project forever?
Excuse me?
I thought that was actually Bedford that's continually under construction and not Billerica.
No, it's Billerica. Goes all the way down to the river. We're in the 6th year, Paul, I think.
Phil, it's not going to call on you anymore.
We should get Rome's construction company.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just elaborate for Frank and the committees, I think what you're referencing in terms of the subsidy, Frank, was on our previous B-line, we did used to receive a subsidy from the MBTA. So Mr. Sanchez and Whitney and the team, in determining how to utilize those transportation funds, felt it would be a good replacement for, again, the subsidy that we would have got for the MBTA in order to run our new program at the COA. So I think that's where the linkage may have come in the minutes. I'm pretty sure, and Doug could elaborate, but I'm pretty sure that was a regular part of John Sanchez's explanation on that warrant article.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Anything else anyone wants to bring up, or I'll be looking for a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Thanks, John. Do I have a second?
Second.
I'm going to assume everyone's voting yes. Screen now. Doug? Oh, no, that's all right. Have a good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.
Nice job, Steve.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Oh, Steve.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.